February 1959 dawn, Winter Mountain, 1079 m above sea level. 9 climbers in a tent at minus 30 degrees were enduring their final night. Then, leaving shoes, coats, and flashlights behind, they suddenly tore the tent and walked into darkness. Footprints led down the snowy slope and stopped in a valley 1.5 km below, after which none of the 9 returned. The 1950s Soviet Union faced US capitalism and communism as two systems vied for global hegemony. At the peak of the Cold War, with the space race prioritized nationally against the US, the only way to prove communist superiority globally was, in every visible field like science, military, and exploration, to present tangible results outperforming the US. In 1957, humanity's first satellite launched by USSR, Sputnik 1 orbited Earth, and the Soviet Union formalized this as concrete proof of system superiority. Sports and physical challenges shared this trend. Conquering extreme environments was not mere leisure, but a way for communist youth to physically prove system superiority. Under this atmosphere, the Soviet Sports Committee operated a climbing certification system, the grade Roman 3 certification, the highest difficulty, classified difficulty by route harshness and weather. In its system, in designated extreme environments, prescribed distance and altitude must be cleared to receive the certification. Like northern Urals in winter, high-risk routes with extreme cold and storms must be completed and returned within a set period. Grade Roman 3 was the official baseline for Soviet mountain elite, and without the certification, joining national climbing activities was structurally impossible. In winter 1959, Igor Dyatlov of Ural Polytechnic Institute Climbing Club organized an expedition to gain Grade Roman 3 certification. The goal was a winter traverse to Mount Ototyn in northern Urals, a limited 16 days and roughly 300 km itinerary, cleared administrative approval from Sverdlovsk Sports Authority. The starting point was set at Vizhai village, passing through Mount Ototyn. It was a round-trip traverse back to Vizhai. The expedition members totaled 10 people. The team leader was Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student and an experienced climber who completed high-risk winter ascents. This expedition was the final step for Grade Roman 3 certification. Other members also held similar qualifications. The oldest, Semyon Solotaryov, a WW2 veteran who would record diaries and weather, Lyudmila Dubinina and Zinaida Kolmogorova, geology major Nikolai Fyborg-Sridnov, who worked at a Moscow nuclear facility, Alexander Kolvatov and Yuri Krivonishenko, Yuri Doroshenko, leading fieldwork and firewood gathering, Rustam Slobodin, maintaining survival gear as a mechanic, and Yuri Yudin, the initial route planner who dropped out and survived, had joined. All 10 previously held multiple high-risk winter climbing records. Being university students or graduates, the Northern Urals winter expedition was predictable, and the progress was continuing without anomaly. On January 23, 1959, at Sverdlovsk railway station, the 10-member expedition boarded a northbound train, transferring between trains and trucks. The itinerary moved toward Urals. An anomaly occurred during movement. Member Yuri Yudin's chronic enteritis and arthritis symptoms worsened again. On January 25, the expedition reached Vizhai, the last settlement toward northern Urals. 2 days later, they reached the second northern geological village. Next day, Yudin's failing health barred further expedition. Eventually, he abandoned the climb and descended alone, restructuring the expedition into 9. Yudin assisted reading maps, compasses, and path identification in the team, as the original task structure adjusted to 9 people. Heavy gear like shared tents and axes were redistributed to remaining members. This was considered manageable within a certain range, with the Dyatlov expedition accepting it as a challenge. The 9 decided to push forward. After leaving the second northern village, they entered mountains completely cut off from settlements. From that point, the members' tracks were verifiable only through their photos and diaries. This meant until the planned February 12 return date, they entered untamed mountains beyond external help.
Ну так я же это шел как бы еще мог идти, а потом это вот это состояние, да, у меня голова-то нормальная, все нормальное, температура нормальная, а по твердой дороге идти это нормально, идешь по ровному месту, а потом процесс шел, но я думаю, что пройдет. Нет, лыжи-то наши везли на лошадь, а я, значит, с ним сел, он меня на лошадь посадил, а мне стало холодно, там невозможно это все. Ну вот пошел, сказал, что тихо ехал он. Под меня это дожидался.
И вам приказал Либо не пойдешь. Такое. Не было такого, да?
Нет, он бы мне это не отказал бы он бы мне, если бы я бы мог идти.
Ну, по состоянию все равно тормозить группу больного.
Да ты что? Да, выходи-то.
Или пешком, там вроде на фотках,
Пешком,
вроде на лыжах были.
На лыжах.
На лыжах, да?
На лыжах я шел нормально, все. А там без лыж-то и не пройти, потому что там был страшный подлип.
Ну вот развернулись-то когда уже? Ну там в медпункты не обращались все-таки раз, болели?
Какой там медпункт?
Ну, въезжаем, может,
Да
что-то
нет, какой там медпункт? Там была машина была попутная, но она была не сразу. Приехал, мне Игорь сказал, что вот на 3 дня задержит.
From January 28, along the Orsby River, the march to gain altitude began. During this time, the northern Urals temperature was around minus 25 to 30 degrees, and heavy, cold air over high snow and ice poured down slopes as katabatic winds, meaning downslope winds blew constantly at 15 to 20 m/s. In this situation, carrying heavy climbing gear and advancing was never easy, even wearing winter clothing. Energy loss to maintain temperature was extreme, pushing through thigh deep snow on harsh slopes. Strong winds constantly battered advancing members, limiting their daily travel distance. On January 31, at the upper Orsby River, members built a temporary food storage labaz. This was in Siberia and northern Russia, where Mansi hunters or Russian expeditions hid part of their food and gear in snow or terrain to reduce unnecessary weight during travel. An outdoor temporary supply method used before entering the final section. Food and supplies for the return route on the way, and it was a standard high-altitude climbing procedure to cache them. This eased the carrying burden greatly, but at the same time, assuming a safe return, it meant advancing while leaving supplies behind, so if they lost direction or strayed off route later on high ground, and unexpected dangers occurred, the survival gear cached in the labaz in emergencies also carried a fatal risk of becoming inaccessible, leaving essential survival supplies behind. The 9 members began climbing toward Kholat-Syakh on the morning of February 1. As altitude rose, the weather began to change abruptly. Arctic gales and blizzards exceeding 20 m/s battered the slopes, rapidly narrowing visibility. Over time, the terrain gradually turned into a total whiteout. In polar regions, winter high mountains, or heavy snow areas, the commonly observed whiteout was no mere blizzard. Due to infinite diffuse reflection of light, the boundary between ground and sky vanished from view, and as terrain outlines blurred, slope steepness and direction could not be visually distinguished. Even with eyes open, discerning direction and elevation was hard. Whether an object ahead was 1 meter away or 10 meters away was impossible to gauge. It was hard to tell if underfoot was a gentle slope or a cliff, making it a weather condition where even expert climbers could easily get lost or fall. Nevertheless, matching their planned route and schedule, members did not stop advancing and continued moving until afternoon. After 2 p.m., the original plan, connecting Orsby Valley and Kholat-Syakh, was to pass the low pass between peaks and enter dense forest that would block blizzards. But retracing the tents found coordinates. The expedition, from their intended route, was already a considerable distance away. With severe whiteout and slope illusions combined, they lost their sense of direction and consequently they presumably strayed off course. In the final frame of the later recovered film, members moving in the blizzard remained faintly. Leading the valley's direction, the group entered Kholat-Syakh's steep eastern slope, and around 5 p.m. the expedition stopped moving and decided to camp where they were exposed to blizzards. To pitch the tent, they had to flatten the ground. Members dug snow under the slope with shovels and knives for the tent. In the urgent situation where the blizzard raged, they barely finished pitching the tent and went inside. The 9 members, taking off and arranging winter coats and shoes, prepared dinner, warmed up, and then left their last journal entry that evening, ending the day. This place, meaning Mountain of the Dead in Nancy, was notorious for strong winds and blizzards. The members' original plan by February 12 was to return to Bishai village, but there was no contact from the team even days later. Anxiety of families and colleagues grew, and finally, at the family's request, Soviet military police and a large search party with college colleagues was organized. On February 26, after long searching, the tent was found on Kholat-Syakh's slope. Inside the tent, their belongings like fur coats, boots, and survival gear like food remained intact, but the members themselves were not found. Clues emerged from the tent. Though the entrance zipper was closed, the tent side and back were torn. On the snow around the tent, members' footprints remained. Bare feet, socks, and shoes were mixed, only belonging to the 9. The footprints led side by side along the slope, continuing into the forest about 1.5 km below. Following footprints, the search party at the forest edge found bodies of Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. It was confirmed they tried to light a campfire near trees. In the section between the tent and campfire, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustam Slobodin, Igor Dyatlov, 3 more bodies were found. They had collapsed while trying to move toward the tent, but unlike expectations, the other 4 bodies could not be found anywhere nearby. The temperature then was below -30 degrees, and the wind chill neared -50 degrees. Snow accumulated ankle deep, and winds were piercingly sharp. Living barefoot in this environment was a choice with extremely low survival chances, and all were presumed to have died of hypothermia. Senior investigator Lev Ivanov felt confused investigating the scene, from the tent's condition to the body's clothing. All clues he faced allowed no logical explanation. The first contradiction emerged from the footprints. No signs of external intrusion were found, and if there was an attack, additional footprints should remain, but the scene had only the victim's traces. The second contradiction emerged from the tent's condition, as if showing climbers faced extreme fear and emergency then. The tent was sharply torn from the inside, and though the zipper was intact, the members confirmedly escaped through the torn gaps instead. The third contradiction emerged from the footprints pattern. Footprints from the tent led irregularly, tangled together, and some wore only 1 shoe. The traces gradually faded after a certain section, and the rescue team tracked the route along remaining traces and terrain. The attempt to light a fire near trees at the forest edge, maintaining a flame in the -30-degree blizzard, was nearly impossible physically, so the fire was already mostly out. Traces of someone climbing up to about 5 m remained on tree trunks. These broken branch marks and skin tissue scraped on bark, as they, in the whiteout, seemed to try to locate the tent. After that point, the 9's movements led in different directions, and they were later found in different sections. Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, in underwear with torn fingernails, remained around the tree, and those who went back up the slope from tree to tent. Dyatlov, Slobodin, Kolmogorova, the 3 stopped at different points. Dyatlov was roughly 300 m from the tree, Slobodin 480 m, and Kolmogorova was found around 650 m in turn, whose body functions dropped sharply during hypothermia's end stage, and all 3, in their moving posture, collapsed and froze toward the tent, and the other 4 bodies, unfound then, including Dubinina, were located months later, deep in the ravine about 75 m from the tree. Unlike the remaining peaceful records, the scene changed inexplicably just hours later. Initial hypotheses on this began to emerge. The first was the Mansi attack theory. Kovatsek was considered sacred by the Mansi, and they speculated climbers broke taboos and faced retaliation, but the Mansi were historically perceived as peaceful natives, and forensic investigation found no signs of external blows or weapons. The second was the wild animal attack theory. The possibility of bears or wolves attacking the tent was raised, but as revealed by the field investigation then around the tent, no animal tracks, droppings, or fur were found at all, and no bite marks were verified on the bodies. The third was a massive avalanche. An avalanche hit the tent during sleep, so the climbers fled in haste, they claimed, but the slope where the tent was installed was relatively gentle for an avalanche to occur, and no signs of an avalanche were found anywhere nearby. Also, if a massive avalanche had occurred, the tent should have been buried completely out of sight, but with only part of it buried in reality. The claim lacked credibility. The fourth was the Soviet military test theory. The Urals were near Soviet military testing grounds, as the Cold War between the US and USSR was in full swing. This claim sparked immense controversy. Local residents testified that in the sky on the day, they witnessed orange flashes and loud roars. Some experts thus missile or secret weapon tests with climbers near the area then raised the possibility of driving them into crisis. However, the local residents' testimonies were excluded from the official investigation file. Soviet authorities officially denied military test possibilities. Ivanov, the field investigator then, in the final report, is known to have left a compelling unknown force. This revealed his confusion and limits then. With no clear cause identified, the case remained unsolved. Part of the case file was classified as secret, and the scene was restricted to the public for years. These measures fueled suspicions that authorities were hiding something from the public further. In 1950s Cold War Soviet society, information control and concealment were rampant. Under the policy prioritizing national security, truth was often hidden. The case's information control and record classification were not unrelated to this context, as controversy continued with controlled data and unknown causes. Months later, the other 4 remaining bodies appeared. Their discovery brought the case into a new phase. On May 4, 1959, as snow melted, the last 4 bodies appeared. The location was down the ravine 75 m from the forest tree, buried 3 m deep in the snow. The bodies were Nikolai Fyborg-Spridnov, Semyon Zolotaryov, Lyudmila Dubinina, and Alexander Kolvatov. According to autopsy results by forensic scientist Fotosheny, the last 4 bodies found were known to be distinct from the initial 5. Unlike previous bodies where freezing in severe cold dominated, severe internal injuries from physical impact were verified in them. In Fyborg-Spridnov's skull, severe fractures including the temporal bone with damage to part of the brain tissue was verified, and Zolotaryov was found with fractured sternum and ribs. Multiple rib fractures were found in Dubinina's case too, and in tissues around the heart from detailed autopsy. Severe signs of bleeding were observed. Forensic scientist Fotosheny, in the report, wrote, "Such damage was caused by extremely strong pressure, but in the skin and surrounding tissues, clear signs of external blows to explain this damage were not found," adding an unusual opinion. This was a clear contradiction forensically, with no signs of external blows. Only internal bones were severely broken. The fracture pattern matched a blunt force blow or a fall from a height, but the skin tissue wrapping it meant it was intact without wounds. The bodies found down the ravine left inexplicable signs besides the internal injuries, especially Dubinina's body lacked a tongue and part of oral tissues was missing when found, and the facial area was reported severely damaged. To this, investigators noted that as buried bodies met spring, they could be damaged by animals like small mammals or birds, or due to severe hypothermia or long burial, vulnerable tissues might necrotize and decay first, offering 2 hypotheses, but the cloth piece wrapped around Dubinina's neck was presumed a living attempt to treat trauma, and Krivonishenko's, found near the bonfire before finger joints being severed, added to this. Simple animal attack or post-mortem necrosis hypotheses clashed. The 4 in the ravine then cut the dead peer's clothes with a knife to wear, which was verified under the tree 3 months ago. When finding Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, parts were recovered cut with a knife. Part cut was wrapped on Dubinina's feet, and the remaining part Kolvatov wore. Also, Dubinina wore Zolotaryov's fur coat too, around the point where they stayed, by gathering branches and clothes, flattening the ground. Signs of trying to build a shelter were found, but the structure remained unfinished. Kolvatov, found during recovery, froze holding Zolotaryov's back from behind. The 4 down the ravine finally, due to cold and severe internal injuries, were recorded dead at the scene. New records were added during the investigation from some bodies and clothes. Beta particles, a type of radiation, were detected, especially from Krivonishenko's and Kolvatov's clothes. The highest levels were verified. The skin of some bodies, witness statements followed that it was discolored orange or brown. This feature suggested radiation exposure or chemical contact possibility. This radiation detection, skin discoloration, and inexplicable severe internal injuries gained focus again, adding credibility to the military test hypothesis. Some researchers raised testing possibilities of vacuum or thermobaric bombs by generating strong pressure waves with consistent traits destroying only internal organs without trauma, matched the strange signs on the bodies. But counter-hypotheses to this also were raised based on concrete evidence for detected radiation. Some hikers had history working in radioactive material facilities, pointing out the exposure timing causal link is unclear. Skin discoloration was also explained differently. Chemical changes from long post-mortem burial in snow or due to severe frostbite. Natural post-mortem phenomenon possibilities were additionally offered. The decisive military test contradiction was the scene's signs. If thermobaric weapons or explosives were used, shockwave signs should remain on terrain or tent debris, but searchers found no signs related to explosions. The 4 bodies found later, showing different patterns from the initial 5 bodies, and the scene centering on signs confirmed in the 4 bodies down the ravine, left new questions. The first possibility was the discovery point's terrain features. While 4 bodies were found inside a deep snow pit down the ravine, the initial 5 were located on a relatively flat slope. Due to this, as a large snow mass rolled down the ravine, the possibility of hitting only the 4 was raised. The second possibility was the difference in death timing, not discovery order. The 4 might might have survived longer than other victims, and in the process of building a temporary shelter and enduring in sub-zero temps, experiencing an additional accident. It was presumed they suffered severe internal injuries. The event went beyond the simple distress accident category and began to clash with the Soviet authorities' control system. The investigation files classified secret, the foreclosure of the scene, and the agency's vague conclusion of an unknown compelling force became the background for ongoing military cover-up suspicions due to the public's continuous demands for the truth. Over 60 years after the incident, the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation began a reinvestigation in 2019 and officially announced in July 2020 concluding the case as an avalanche. In January 2021, the following year, a joint research team from EPFL and ETH Zurich confirmed in autopsy records severe chest injuries equivalent to a car crash. To verify if it could be reproduced, reportedly applied then weather and terrain conditions to a simulation. According to the analysis, the snow on the Kolotsek slope was already hard wind-backed upper snow and the weak, fragile lower snow layer beneath stacked unstably. Here, three causes overlapped, leading to the accident. The hikers dug out the lower slope snow to pitch a tent, and by leveling it, the lower snow layer supporting the upper slab's weight weakened as bitter strong winds blew overnight. The analysis shows new snow kept piling above the tent, adding weight. Eventually, in the night hours after pitching the tent, unable to withstand the weight, covering directly above the tent, the hard concrete-like snow slab cracked and slid straight down. While this was not a massive mountain-wide avalanche, a single hard snow slab around the tent broke and hit the tent area directly below, equivalent to a car crash on the lying hikers' chests and heads, was analyzed enough to give a fatal impact. This snow slab collapse occurring hours later in the night. The hikers who went to bed after dinner, defenselessly during sleep without knowing why, chose the possibility of being impacted as tremendous snow mass pressure suddenly hit while asleep. Panicked hikers had no time to escape, and as the tent entrance was also blocked, they eventually slashed the tent with a knife and seemed to have no choice but to escape hastily. As a result, the later found falls, rib fractures, and skull wounds could be explained by the impact at the snow slab collapse. Besides, as the group in the dark fled to the ravine and hit rocks or equipment, the possibility of being additionally injured was also raised together during the investigation process. However, this conclusion of the Russian prosecution was immediately refuted by bereaved families and experts. While avalanches usually occur on steep slopes of over 30 degrees, the Kolotsek slope where the tent sat was about 15 degrees for snow to slide down, pointing out it was too gentle and stable terrain. If a snow slab large enough to cause fatal impact hit above the tent should have also suffered a corresponding level of damage, but the tent was only half buried, and items inside like backpacks, food, and cameras were mostly intact, remaining a question. Also, if the impact was applied, injuries should have been left evenly on all hikers, but fatal fractures were confirmed in only some hikers. In particular, the unusual damage where Jubinina's tongue and some oral tissues disappeared remained a circumstance not fully explained by a simple snow slab collapse. Above all, the fatally injured hikers, right after the avalanche, did not die immediately, and the fact they moved up to 1.5 km away made a fire and endured, that they even after the avalanche survived and acted for a considerable time, clashes with the existing causal relationship. In these various circumstances, the families did not accept the government's avalanche conclusion after 60 years. Suspicions that a greater truth might be hidden did not subside. Experts also pointed out that the Swiss team's simulation was based on ideal conditions inside the computer. Actual blizzard patterns, snow density, and fine terrain variables were not fully reflected. In addition, the military testing theory, constantly highlighted since right after the incident, surfaced once again. Some researchers raised the possibility that Soviet military activities or missile tests were connected to the incident, and even argued the connection of the R7 Eichmann test. This was that the orange lights and roar in the sky, testified by local residents at the time, occurred during the missile testing process, and the blast and shockwaves generated then put the hikers into extreme panic and caused external injuries. The Russian government officially denied this military connection, but the fact that some documents related to the incident are still classified as confidential amplified the suspicions. The state's official announcement and private empirical suspicions still sharply clashed. However, apart from these debates, medical analysis to explain the tracks left on the site also followed. In addition to the avalanche analysis to explain the strange traces remaining on the site, the presented medical analysis is as follows. The phenomenon where Krivonenko and Doroshenko were found in only underwear at the search was the paradoxical undressing phenomenon occurring in late severe hypothermia. This means when human body temperature drops to a dangerous level to temporarily protect major organs, it constricts blood vessels in limbs, but when reaching the limit situation right before freezing to death, as this regulatory function collapses, the closed blood vessels suddenly open. In this process, as warm internal blood rapidly spreads throughout the body. In the freezing cold, the patient rather feels as if the body is burning, falling into a paradoxical illusion of feeling intense heat. Eventually, in extreme mental confusion, they take off clothes themselves, accelerating death, and the disheveled clothing state of some hikers recorded in the autopsy report also was argued to match this explanation in circumstances as the initial cause for the hikers to hastily escape the tent. Special environmental factors created by the terrain were also discussed. Between collapse slope and surrounding mountain peaks, in narrow terrain, wind concentrates to one side and a phenomenon where the intensity is amplified occurs. At this time, as the FO vortices, very low frequency vibrations that humans cannot directly hear with ears, the possibility of generating so-called infrasound was raised. These low frequency vibrations to humans, anxiety, pressure, and confusion of direction sense, through a hypothesis that they can cause, meant this phenomenon could be related to the hiker's urgent actions. In addition, one person's fear in an extreme situation, the emotional contagion phenomenon rapidly spreading around, led to a state of collective panic. A socio-psychological analysis was added, the perceived temperature reaching -50 degrees and paralyzing strong winds, and the narrow, enclosed tent structure greatly reduced the hiker's normal judgment. Under these conditions was the background where the possibility of leading to momentary panic was raised, connecting the leading hypotheses, analyses, and possibilities so far chronologically. The Dyatlov incident is reconstructed in the following flow. Due to the snow slab collapse right above the tent and infrasound, as estimated environmental factors acted complexly, the hikers in the narrow tent momentarily fell into extreme panic. In a situation where the entrance was blocked or normal escape became difficult, the hikers tore the tent with knives and rushed outside in a state close to barefoot. To build a fire and escape the cold, they moved to the forest 1.5 km below, but failed amid severe cold, blizzards, and whiteout. Eventually, the initial 5 people died of hypothermia, and some of them stripped off clothes in the illusion of feeling hot, being found in a state of paradoxical undressing. The remaining 4 fell while moving toward the snow den in the valley, or suffered an additional accident colliding with snow masses, and died from severe internal injuries with fractured bones. This reconstruction seems to explain several questions of the site, but compared with the initial field records, it still leaves the following 4 contradictions unachieved. The first is the contradiction between footprint preservation and impact. The official announcement explained that the snow collapse around the tent occurred in a limited area, so the lower footprints could be preserved. However, if a strong physical impact had acted, questions were raised that it would be difficult for footprints to be intactly preserved. The second is the absence of avalanche traces. Because the site was discovered 25 days after the incident, there is a possibility that some traces disappeared, but ski poles supporting the tent also remained in the snow without damage. And above all, the initial searchers on the site to support an avalanche are told not to have confirmed clear traces. Accordingly, questions were raised about the credibility of the avalanche hypothesis. Third is the behaviors after fractures, with some hikers suffering fatal injuries such as ribs and skull fractures. They tore the tent and moved 1.5 kilometers down the slope, and performed complex survival activities like attempting to build a temporary shelter, was not sufficiently explained by existing hypotheses alone. Fourth is radiation detection and information control. Radiation detected on some clothing of Krivonishenko and Kolvatov. Failure to draw clear conclusions from Russia's reinvestigation and Swiss analysis. Soviet authorities' classification of files and long-term site closure left doubts unresolved for a long time. Lastly, regarding the cause of Dubinina's missing tongue and oral tissues, it was left as a mystery. Theories like animal damage, decomposition, and trauma, various hypotheses raised, failed to provide decisive evidence. Yuri Yudin, the only survivor, regarding the mysterious deaths of his colleagues, tracked the truth throughout his life, but failed to confirm the answer in the end. Passed away in 2013. On the slope of Kolatsak, only the torn tent and descending footprints remained, though many explanations piled up on traces for over 60 years. Questions from the initial records were never fully resolved, and humans, even now not where explanations end, are climbing the same mountain toward where explanations stop. On the night of November 24, 1971, the rear staircase of a Boeing 727 flying over Seattle suddenly opened. A man carrying a bundle of $200,000 in cash and a parachute jumped into 320 km/h winds, freezing temperatures, and pouring rain. The man, who had boarded the plane under the name Dan Kuba, evaded the pursuing fighter jets and vanished into the cold rain. Decades passed. The FBI began tracking the man, launching the longest manhunt in the agency's history, but his name never once appeared in an arrest record. And with neither his survival nor his death ever confirmed, he remained missing. Where did the man who vanished into the sky that night go? November 24, 1971, 2:50 p.m. The atmosphere at Portland International Airport was unusually calm. A man appeared at the counter and asked for a one-way ticket to Seattle on Northwest Orient Airlines. He looked like an ordinary gentleman in a black suit and sunglasses. writing Dan Cooper on the passenger manifest and paying the fare in cash. At the time, airline security didn't require ID checks, and there weren't even X-ray scanners. Because of this, unidentified men carrying hidden bombs would sometimes make their way onto planes. The man took seat 18C, the rearmost seat on Flight 305, a Boeing 727. 10 minutes after takeoff, he politely handed a note to Flight Attendant Florence Schaffner. At the time, flight attendants often received notes from male passengers with their names or phone numbers. When she tried to slip it into her pocket, assuming it was just another flirtatious note, the man quietly said, "Miss, you better read that note. I have a bomb in my bag," he murmured softly. When she opened his bag, recorded wires that looked like a homemade explosive and a thick bundle of cylindrical batteries came into view. At that moment, the still air inside the cabin seemed to stiffen with tension. The man remained astonishingly calm. As he conveyed his demands, he demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes, making it conditional on refueling at Seattle Airport. He ordered whiskey on board, paid for it himself, and even showed the composure to refuse the change. This unusual calmness left the crew and ground investigators with a strong impression that this was not a random act, but a carefully calculated plan in motion. November 24, 1971, 5:24 p.m. The hijacked Flight 305 made an emergency landing on the runway of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. As demanded by the hijacker, Dan Cooper, a bag containing $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes were delivered on board, and, as promised, he released all 36 passengers safely. The hijacker ordered the plane to take off again, leaving only the 4 crew members on board, and as soon as the remaining fuel was loaded, he directed the plane toward Mexico City. He instructed the cockpit to maintain an altitude of 10,000 feet, about 3,000 meters, a relatively low flying height, and to fly with the landing gear down, seemingly preparing the conditions for an aerial escape. Around 8:13 p.m., a sudden change in air pressure was detected on the instruments of the plane passing near Ariel, Washington. Due to the unique design of the Boeing 727, the rear stairs, which could be opened even in flight, were fully lowered into the darkness, with temperatures at -7°C and winds reaching 320 km/h, along with heavy rain that obscured visibility. The man strapped the bundle of cash to his body and plunged into the pitch-black air. The 2 U.S. Air Force F-106 fighter jets following behind were blocked by the blind spots of the low-flying airliner and the severe weather, and failed to capture the decisive moment when the man opened his parachute and quietly vanished. Immediately after the man exited, the interior of Flight 305 was engulfed in an eerie silence. The plane landed as scheduled at Reno Airport in Nevada, but at the end of the open rear stairs, only 2 leftover parachutes and the tie the man had worn, along with the whiskey glasses he had used, remained as evidence at the scene. Even though the ground investigation team immediately searched the plane thoroughly, there were no fingerprints or DNA evidence to confirm the real identity of Dan Cooper, blocked by the technological limitations of the 1970s. From the moment the culprit vanished into the sky, the case entered a phase of investigation that followed the remaining traces and clues. In the early hours of November 25, 1971, the FBI immediately launched a full-scale search operation under the code name Rorschach. In the rugged mountains and dense forests of southwestern Washington, over 1,000 military and law enforcement personnel, along with helicopters, were deployed, searching based on the suspect's predicted drop zone. The area covered was equivalent to 14,000 soccer fields, spanning more than 100 square kilometers. But the 320 km/h winds and heavy rain at the time of the jump prevented authorities from pinpointing the drop zone, contrary to their expectations. Despite thousands of search attempts, nothing was found at the site. While the ground search faced difficulties, the investigation team focused on reconstructing the suspect's face based on the crew's testimonies. A quiet man in his mid-40s, wearing a black suit and of ordinary appearance. The black and white composite sketch based on this description was distributed across investigative networks nationwide. In 1972, an updated version including the sunglasses he had worn was created, becoming the iconic representation of the figure known as D. Cooper. Using the composite sketch based on the flight attendant's testimonies, investigators launched a widespread manhunt for suspects. Early in the investigation, authorities identified a man named D. Cooper living in Oregon as a prime suspect, taking him into custody immediately and subjecting him to intensive questioning. However, he was soon cleared of any connection to the case. And during the process, a media error led to the suspect's alias, Dan Cooper, being mistakenly reported as D. Cooper. The name then stuck in the investigation records, creating an unintentionally humorous twist in the story. 5 months after the original incident, in April 1972, a so-called copycat crime mimicking Cooper's hijacking occurred, throwing the investigation into chaos. A former Marine and parachute expert, Richard McCoy, hijacked an identical Boeing 727 and took $500,000 before jumping into the air. He flawlessly replicated Cooper's method of opening the rear stairs mid-flight, once again exposing a loophole in the security system. However, after McCoy was captured, evidence comparison revealed that fingerprints, hair, and other traces collected from the cabin showed no match to Cooper's data, sending the DB Cooper investigation back to square one. Afterwards, several individuals who bore an uncanny resemblance to the composite sketches, Sheridan Peterson, an actual skydiver, and Robert Rackstraw, a former special operations helicopter pilot killed in parachuting, were the most notable examples. In particular, Rackstraw's military ID photo was an almost perfect match to the FBI composite. From his eyes to his jawline, the investigation team checked thousands of tips and interrogated over 800 suspects, but evidence such as the 8 cigarette butts at the tie collected on the plane, as well as seat fingerprints, ran into technical limitations and could not be linked to any real individual. Eventually, they were stored in the FBI's evidence vault. Another shocking record obtained by the investigators was the military ID of former Special Forces operative Ted B. Braden. He was a former member of the U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, and a seasoned veteran who served in the legendary Covert Operations Unit (SOG) during the Vietnam War. Records show he was a unique expert. With over 400 high-altitude jumps, even within the military, he was deemed uncontrollable. With a dark history that included unauthorized absences and a dishonorable discharge for smuggling, the reason Braden emerged as a prime suspect was due to his overwhelming technical expertise. With a precise grasp of a Boeing 727F stair design, he could survive a sub-zero jump with bundles of cash. Possessing the rare physical and tactical skills of a real-life pro, with his whereabouts remaining a complete mystery at the time, and witness accounts of him boasting hijacking is a piece of cake. It kept investigators on the absolute edge, yet even Braden, facing a lack of decisive evidence, could not move beyond the realm of speculation. The fingerprints on board never matched his data, leaving him unindicted, just a page in the files. From McCoy and Rackstraw to Braden, as top military experts filled the suspect list. Paradoxically, the figure of DB Cooper became a technical myth that the authorities could never truly reach, while over 30 hijackings occurred annually across the United States at the time. Most ended with suspects caught or killed on sight. Yet Cooper's case spanned over 8 years, leaving his trail vanished without a trace. Then on the afternoon of February 10, 1980, at Tina Bar along the Columbia River near Vancouver, the lost cache finally resurfaced. 80-year-old Brian Ingram, camping with his family, was digging into the riverbank to pitch a tent when he found decaying bills still tied with rubber bands. There were 294 $20 bills, totaling $5,880 out of the $200,000 taken by the suspect, roughly $1.5 million after inflation. The discovery represented a mere 3% of the ransom. FBI forensic analysis later confirmed that the serial numbers matched the ransom money delivered to Cooper during the 1971 hijacking. For 9 more years, these bills remained buried within a river's currents and layers of sediment, mysteriously intact in bundles, even with the rubber bands. The USCS and FBI teams analyzed the soil and diatoms microscopic plankton to trace the money's path. However, the math between the downstream discovery and the upstream jump site simply didn't add up, causing a massive gridlock in the investigation. The fact that the bills were found in bundles fueled the theory that he died and lost the money, while bolstering claims that he buried it as a decoy to survive. Deepening the mystery of his fate, the bundles of bills found after 9 years were seen as the crucial lead to crack the case. While the bills were hard proof that he truly existed, they became a bizarre record of a life-risking ransom, remaining buried and untouched for 9 long years. Then in the 2010s, through electron microscope analysis, a decisive lead was captured from the suspect's tie. Particles rarely found in typical environments, pure titanium and rare earth elements, were detected. This suggested he was an insider in the aerospace industry. Yet even with such advanced forensics, the DNA from the evidence and the suspects repeatedly failed to match, proving only the gap, and the case returned to square one. Eventually, on July 8, 2016, the FBI Seattle field office suspended Norjack, officially ending the 45-year-long pursuit. The name Dan Cooper remains one of the most mysterious cold cases in FBI history, and his disappearance, after outsmarting the law, faded into the shadows of history. In Ariel, Washington, the site of the incident, a bizarre festival called Cooper Day has been celebrated for decades in his memory. The FBI investigation has ceased, and for 50 years, he has never once resurfaced. Who was the real D? Cooper? Is he still out there, somewhere? His whereabouts remain a mystery to this day. In 1888, in the district of Whitechapel, England, one murder set off a chain of killings. As similar patterns began to appear across different alleys, fear quickly gripped the entire city of London. Scotland Yard launched a massive manhunt immediately. But the killer vanished every time, leaving only traces, and at the center of it all was the unidentified figure known as Jack the Ripper. In 1888, the population of Whitechapel, an East London slum, reached nearly 80,000. The common lodging houses to hold them numbered 233 in total. Every night, over 8,500 people waited in endless lines for a single bed was informants. Those who couldn't even get that were left to spend the night on cold alley floors. At the time, the child mortality rate in Whitechapel was 55%. 1 in 2 children often died before reaching adulthood. Even the survivors, in alleys of constant alcohol and violence, had to struggle for survival every single night, while similar cases piled up in police records. Despite the screams heard every night, it was rare to find any neighbor who reacted. Indifference to a neighbor's screams had already become a daily reality, while thick smog and fog from burning coal constantly blighted the Whitechapel area. The dim gaslights on the night streets only further restricted visibility. Over 1,200 sex workers were recorded. Most had to go out into the alleys every night to pay for lodging. There were few other options for survival at the time. Based on Christian values, the Victorian era emphasized outward modesty and moral purity. Behind that, those who sought such services remained outside these alleys. Within this structure, these women were socially shunned. In Spitalfields, bordering Whitechapel, there were maze-like settlements called rookeries. Dozens of dead-end alleys were layered together. Once an outsider stepped into these passages, they quickly lost their sense of direction and could barely escape. According to London City Hall records, some areas were already classified as untraceable. Tracking the movements of someone who vanished into the alleys was virtually impossible. In the mid-1880s, large-scale demolition for large-scale railway construction set displaced residents into Whitechapel. The saturated population was further compressed. In the process, police patrols failed to keep up with the changes. As blind spots beyond surveillance increased, the balance of control slowly began to crumble. In July of the same year, protesting low wages and dangerous work environments, women working in the nearby bow match factory led the match girls' strike. As security forces concentrated in Bow to suppress the strike, gaps began to appear in Whitechapel's patrols. These security gaps, layered over the complex terrain, soon materialized into actual events. On August 31st, at 3:40 a.m., Officer Neil, patrolling Bucks Row in Whitechapel, found a woman collapsed on the road. Seen nearby just an hour before discovery, she had gone into the alley to find the 4-pence lodging fee, only to be killed within that short window. She was Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old mother of 5. At the scene, fatal cuts to the throat and precise mutilation of the body were confirmed. Even in narrow alleys and dense housing, no signs of resistance were found, and the crime went unnoticed by anyone nearby. In fact, just before Officer Neil arrived, even 2 carmen passing just meters away didn't realize it was a human body. This meant that in about an hour, the killer completed the entire process: approach, attack, and escape. Later, Dr. Reeswell, who performed the autopsy, recorded that the cuts were made deliberately with a single tool. Even when the police secured the scene, no traces were left in the surrounding area. The police were treating this as an isolated case. But 8 days later, the same method of crime reoccurred, marking a new turning point. Around 6:00 a.m. on September 8th, in the back out of 29 Hanbury Street, the body of 47-year-old Annie Chapman was found, living in lodging houses after her divorce. On the dawn of the incident, to her landlord, she said she lacked the 4-pence and left for the alley. Found murdered within just a few hours, her body showed throat cuts and severe abdominal damage. At the scene, some body parts were missing, and 2 coins and paper fragments lay at the feet. While investigators judged these as Chapman's belongings, whether they were dropped during the crime or intentionally placed remained unconfirmed. Through this case, specific conditions of the crime first emerged. Dr. George Badger Phillips, who performed the autopsy, estimated the murder weapon based on the removal of specific parts and anatomical skill, using a sharp knife at least 15 to 20 cm long. The signs of selective removal in a short time made it difficult to see as an accidental crime. Accordingly, surgeons or medical students in London and butchers began to be cited as likely suspect categories, instead of chaotic destruction, only precise direction and patterned mutilation remained at the scene. This, compared to the murders occurring around the same time, such as Emma Elizabeth Smith or the random assaults in the Martha Tavern case, showed a clearly different pattern. Police eventually focused on groups with specific skills, placing doctors and butchers on the suspect list. This investigation soon spread across society via the media. In early September, through London newspapers, the Whitaker-Capel serial murders were competitively reported. As unconfirmed rumors and investigative secrets leaked, tension formed between the police and the press over information control. Ultimately, these events moved beyond simple violent crimes, plunging all of London into a state of terror. On September 27, a letter written in red ink arrived at the Central News Agency. The letter, postmarked September 25th, began with blatant mockery of the investigators, ending with the signature, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." At the time, police dismissed it as a prank or a copycat, not considering it a serious lead for the investigation. However, in the early hours of September 30th, 3 days later, 2 successive murders occurred in London in a single night, plunging the city into uncontrollable chaos. At 12:35 a.m., Israel Schwartz, who was passing near Berners Street at the time, testified that he saw a woman being roughly shoved by a man. About 55 minutes later, at 1:00 a.m., Louis Dienschitz, a club steward in the area, was driving his car into Dupfield's yard when he discovered the body of 45-year-old Elizabeth Stride, moving between common lodging houses to survive. She was holding a packet of sweets in her left hand and flowers in the other upon discovery. These circumstances were cited as a possibility that she had been in contact with someone just before her death. The cause of death was a cut to the throat, but unlike previous cases, no further mutilation was found. Police suggested the crime was interrupted by external factors, assuming the killer moved to a nearby area right after being disturbed. Just 40 minutes after that shock, another body was discovered. At 1:35 a.m., at the entrance of Mitre Square, Joseph Wand spotted a man talking with Catherine Eddowes. The man was described as being around 30 with a brown mustache, and this sighting became the benchmark for the subsequent events. Just 10 minutes later, at 1:45 a.m., when Officer Watkins patrolled the same area again, Eddowes' body was discovered. As social anxiety intensified due to the serial murders, patrol intervals had been narrowed to 10 minutes. The crime was estimated to have been committed within an extremely short window of about 10 minutes, along with a cut to the throat. The scene revealed the removal of associated organs, facial mutilation, and incisions to the ear. Given that such mutilation occurred in a short time, some medical staff suggested a certain level of proficiency. As to whether this could be seen as anatomical expertise, opinions remained divided due to the thick fog and complex urban layout. The crimes and movements proceeded without being easily exposed. Meanwhile, the Stride and Eddowes cases were handled by the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police, belonging to different administrative jurisdictions, which caused delays in their mutual information sharing. As a result, investigators failed to immediately link the 2 cases, experiencing confusion in their initial response. At 2:55 a.m. on September 30th, on the floor of the building entrance on Dalston Street, a piece of blood-stained apron was discovered. This was a portion of the murdered Catherine Eddowes' apron, and a chalked sentence remained on the wall just above. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Investigators at the scene suggested preserving the handwriting and text through photography before daybreak. However, Commissioner Charles Warren of the Metropolitan Police refused, fearing anti-Semitic riots and worsening public sentiment. Even before daybreak, he ordered the sentence on the wall to be erased immediately. With that decision, the direct message left by the killer vanished forever, and the key evidence to clarify the case, such as chalk handwriting or pressure, could no longer be analyzed. Ultimately, only incomplete sentences reconstructed based on the memories of witnesses remained in the police records. On October 1st, a postcard with the killer's nickname, signed Saucy Jackie, meaning cheeky and bold, was received. The record directly mentioned the double event from the previous day, containing content that marked the investigation process, and the handwriting was confirmed to match the Dear Boss letter. The Metropolitan Police released the handwriting of both letters and distributed 80,000 leaflets across London, seeking tips. However, this led to over 1,000 anonymous letters flooding into the investigative authorities within days. As copycat pranks and false reports mixed together, it caused chaos, making even valid clues difficult to identify. Ultimately, investigative personnel were overwhelmed, sorting the truth of endless anonymous tips, consuming limited resources and time. On October 3rd, as copies of the letters were posted at Whitaker-Capel stations, the public officially encountered the name Jack the Ripper. London newspapers, printing over 1 million copies daily, repeatedly exposed the name, spreading fear. As unconfirmed details spread as well, the case grew like a massive urban legend. Amidst such social anxiety and chaos, to address the security gap, on October 6, the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, led by George Lusk, was formed and began night patrols. 10 days after the organization was formed, inside a parcel delivered to Lusk's house, a part of a human body was discovered, and the enclosed letter had just 3 words: "From hell." At the time, the Dear Boss and Saucy Checky letters were of uncertain credibility due to media involvement and hoaxes. However, the organ delivered with the From Hell letter was identified as human by Dr. Thomas Hopenshaw's examination, and while it matched the circumstances of the missing part from Catherine Eddowes' body, it was never confirmed to be the same one. Among physical evidence and countless tip letters, it became impossible to discern the killer's true traces, and the investigation hit a deadlock. On November 8, Commissioner Charles Warren resigned, leading to a change in leadership. But the next morning at Miller's Court, a scene more extreme than before was discovered. Around 4:00 p.m., neighbor Elizabeth Prater heard a scream of murder. She did not move from her bed. Later testifying about the situation in court, the scream, buried in daily numbness, drew no response, and the final moment to intervene at the scene vanished into the silence of the dawn. At 10:45 a.m. on November night, about 6.5 hours after the incident at 13 Miller's Court, the landlord's assistant arrived to collect overdue rent. There was no response from inside, and the door was locked. He peered through the window and immediately called the police. But in the official records, no specific description of what he saw beyond the glass remained, as even some police statements were kept private in court. The scene remained as an unofficial sighting, and what happened behind the closed doors of Miller's Court remains a mystery even to this day. The brief record left by Dr. Thomas Bond, who performed the autopsy, was shocking. The body of 25-year-old Mary Jane Kelly was found on the bed, far more mutilated than in previous cases, to the point where she was barely recognizable. Investigators at the scene confirmed that parts of the body were separated and missing, and the lost organs were not found anywhere in the room. The space and conditions of the case differed from the previous 4. The crime took place indoors, hidden from outside view, reducing the risk of intervention and removing time constraints. This suggested that the degree and extremity of the same crime would vary depending on time and lack of interference. Academics offered 2 analyses regarding this. One view is that extreme acts were expressed as time constraints vanished. Another interpretation is that even the minimal control maintained during the serial crimes completely collapsed. However, neither side has been confirmed by physical evidence. Ultimately, this case was recorded as the final victim of the canonical 5. The 5 core victims, officially recognized in the Jack the Ripper serial murders. The discovery of Kelly's body occurred just 24 hours after Commissioner Charles Warren submitted his resignation. After November 9th, incidents with the same pattern as the canonical 5 were no longer recorded. However, deaths in Whitechapel did not come to a complete halt. In December of the same year, Rose Minot died, and in July 1889, Alice Mackenzie was victimized. The police excluded both cases from the Ripper investigation, citing that the cutting techniques and mutilation patterns differed. Yet the danger and anxiety remained. Questions regarding why the killer stopped converged into 3 possibilities: the suspect's death, departure from London or imprisonment, and self-termination, but these were merely unconfirmed speculative hypotheses, with no physical evidence or definitive consensus reached. In late November 1888, the British Home Office issued an official letter refusing to pay a reward. False tips were throwing the investigation into chaos, and the inquiry had reached its limits. Tracking experiments using bloodhounds Barnaby and Burgo also failed. Amidst the complex maze of alleys and traces left by thousands, identifying the killer's path was practically impossible. Ultimately, the only thing that remained certain was the fact that the Jack the Ripper pattern of crimes had ceased. Since then, attempts by investigative authorities to apprehend Jack the Ripper have continued. In 1894, an internal report written by Assistant Commissioner Melville McHatton, known as the McHatton Memoranda, identified 3 primary suspects: Montague John Fruit, who disappeared right after the last case and was found dead in the Thames in late December; Aaron Kaczynski, a Jewish barber living in Whitechapel, who drew attention for his severe mental illness and hatred of women; and Michael Ostrov, a Russian doctor with a criminal record, thought to have dangerous tendencies and medical knowledge. All three were suspected for different reasons, but no decisive physical evidence or clues linking them to the cases existed. Meanwhile, in the personal notes of Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the so-called Swanson marginally pointed to Kuzminski, stating that a Jewish witness identified the killer but refused to testify, leading to a failure in prosecution. This, too, provided no real help to the investigation. On February 13, 1891, beneath a railway arch in White-Capelle, the body of Frances Coles was found with her throat cut, causing the final investigative net to move once more. James Sadler, a sailor who drank with her right before her murder, was arrested after being found near the scene in blood-stained clothes. He was identified as a prime suspect, but no charges were filed due to insufficient evidence. With this case, the Serial Murder Task Force was officially disbanded, and the White-Capelle murders file was closed by Scotland Yard, the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police. Ultimately, the names revealed in the investigation failed to connect, remaining only as isolated possibilities. In 2002, an attempt was made to clarify the century-old case using modern science. Crime novelist Patricia Cornwell extracted DNA from the stamps of the Dear Boss letters and began a massive analysis comparing them with samples from artist Walter Sickert. The contamination of evidence from passing through countless hands and the preservation limits of documents from that era were clear. The scientific results instead only sparked further controversy, and this attempt also failed to lead to definitive evidence. In 2014, a shawl, a long outer garment worn over the shoulders, gained attention as it was presumed to be Catherine Eddowes' possession. Russell Edwards, a British businessman and amateur detective, purchased the shawl at an auction in 2007, and with Jari Laurelainen, a genetics expert at Liverpool John Moores University, compared the extracted DNA with descendants of Aaron Kuznetsky. Claims that the mitochondrial DNA matched suggested a potential breakthrough in the case, but it wasn't even confirmed if the shawl was Eddowes' actual property. Academic rebuttals regarding the statistical methods and sample authenticity followed. Even the theory regarding Aaron Kuznetsky, the most prominent suspect, is blocked by the witness's reliability, and the original decision not to prosecute. The theory about Montague John Prout is merely circumstantial, based on the proximity of his death to the end of the crimes, as no physical evidence exists to connect the two. Countless hypotheses, including the royal family conspiracy theory, clash with each other, each asserting its own logic, but definitive evidence remains elusive. In White-Capelle today, night tours related to the case are consistently operated. Tourists move along the locations where the crimes occurred, experiencing the events firsthand. Even now, 137 years later, the identity of the unidentified killer who plunged London into terror, Jack the Ripper, remains an unsolved mystery.